For Young's will always stand out to me as representative of what's wrong with the death penalty and the real consequences it has on everyone involved. Chris Young was sentenced to death in 2006 for the robbery and murder of convenience store owner Hash Patel in San Antonio 2 years prior. He was 21 years old at the time of the crime, and like so many on death row, suffered terrible trauma as a child. He was born to a teenage mother who moved the family multiple times and brought violent men into their lives. Chris's own father was murdered when he was 8 years old. And shortly thereafter, he turned to a street gang as a source of support in his life and a source of community. By his own admission, Chris had a lot of growing up to do when he arrived on death row, but in the 12 years that he spent there, he matured greatly. He educated himself, he became an artist, and he did everything he could to actively parent his young daughter, Chriselle. Through an active letter writing, correspondence, and sometimes prison visits, he also mentored troubled young people, including extended family members, and was working with them to help them avoid making the mistakes he had made in his own life. The person that the state of Texas planned to kill was not the same man who had killed Hash Patel. He was so much more than his worst act. I wanted you to have a chance to see Chris and hear him in his own words. So I have a couple video clips. Mike, if you could.
You know, one thing I learned when I first came here, was I was here to get an execution date. And it took years to come to grips with it. I don't accept it, but it's a part of the process. It's part of the process. So what I want to do is just get my family ready for it. Get the ones that love me ready for it, because although I can deal with it, they have to learn to deal with it, you know. And although I'm put in these situations that is adverse, I can still do something with myself. Not many people have an opportunity to do what I'm doing right now. You know, a lot of people just exist back there, they don't live. I was an alcoholic in the world. I was a bad alcoholic and a drug addict. And when you're not pumped full of drugs and you're not drunk, you have time to think. You have time to tap into your creativity. I've been painting for like 5 years now. Never would have thought I'd have picked up a paintbrush. You know, I've written 2 books. So I've tapped into that creativity I never thought I would have if I was still on drugs. I really haven't ever had a chance to really apologize to my family either. Because although I thought I was being protective of them, I really hurt them too. And so I want to apologize to them too. None of that was intentional, but I think they'll appreciate who I am now. And that's what I really want to show people, how a person can change, can grow up and mature. And so although I do apologize for putting them through this stress, I hope they can appreciate where I am now.
Great, thank you, Mike. I also wanted you to hear just a little bit from Chris's daughter, Chriselle, if you wouldn't mind playing just a minute of that second video for me.
See him like 2 days ago, and we talked about a lot, and he was telling me how he missed me and how he wanted to see me in person, like to where we could hug and I could give him hugs. And he writes me a lot, and he tells me how much he loves me, and he's good at drawing and painting, and he's nice, and we look alike. I told him I want to be a lawyer and a surgeon. He asked me what kind of lawyer, and I said I don't know. And then he asked me why I had lip gloss on, and I was like, I don't know. And he was like, you think you grown? And I was like, I don't know. I want to hug.
That's good. Thank you. So when Chris received an execution date of July 17th, 2018, his attorneys sought to present a full picture of the man he had become to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles in his application for clemency. Just as a note, the Board of Pardons and Paroles members are appointed by the governor, and they have to recommend that an individual facing execution is deserving of clemency in order for the governor of Texas to act. That recommendation is not binding, however, and since Texas resumed executions in 1982, a total of 5 people have received recommendations of clemency from this Board of Pardons and Paroles. So it's a very steep hill to climb, but it's one of the only ways to try to stop an execution outside of the court system. So there was a clemency petition at the time, and then a parallel legal strategy involved asking the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is our state's highest criminal court, to reconsider an earlier ruling related to claims of religious discrimination during the jury selection process during Chris's original trial, which is the issue that first brought me into this case in 2016. A woman had been struck from serving on Chris's jury because she told the attorneys, the prosecutor, the homeless ministry program at her local church, and they thought that disqualified her from serving as a fair and impartial juror. So in my experience, most defense attorneys want to keep cameras and microphones as far away from their clients as possible. But in this case, Chris himself played a really active role in the campaign to save his life. We had unprecedented access to him, as you could see, through essays, through photos, and through these video interviews that were conducted by a filmmaker named Lawrence Rush, who had met Chris through Chris's attorney, David Dow, many years ago. Lawrence and another filmmaker brought the videos of Chris to Mitesh Patel, the son of Hash Patel, the man that Chris had killed, and he watched them over and over. He found them so compelling that he decided then and there, 3 weeks before the scheduled execution, to call for mercy for Chris. He did not want Chris's daughters to grow up without a father the way that he and Chris did. And he supported Chris's aspirations to contribute meaningfully to his community, even from behind bars. So I have just one more video for you. This is Mitesh talking about why he advocated for mercy for Chris Young.
Anything to change our journey. You killed my dad, you're killing him. 2 wrongs don't make a right. My dad was doing positive things, all right? And Chris took that opportunity away from my dad. Now, I look at Chris wanting to do something positive, and if the state takes that away from him, they're no different than Chris.
Hopes, if you could just kind of summarize your hope for clemency.
I feel like the governor should listen to me because I'm the victim's son. I'm forgiving the man that's alive today who's remorseful and wants to change other people. I can't forgive or forget Chris Young from 14 years ago.
I look at death row as saving my life. I wouldn't be able to
So from the end of June until July 17th, we worked feverishly with Chris's attorneys and a team of supporters, including religious leaders like Larry James of City Square in Dallas, some of you may know, and Rick McClatchy, the head of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of Texas, the filmmakers, members of Chris's family, to mobilize support and to stop his execution. We had a petition that eventually was signed by more than 60,000 people. We did a lot of work with faith leaders statewide and in San Antonio. We tried to get his story out into the media. Despite these efforts, however, the Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 6-0 against clemency. The courts denied all appeals, and Governor Abbott declined to use his limited authority to grant a 30-day stay of execution. So on July 17th, 2018, the state of Texas executed Chris Young. He was 34 years old and is one of the 570 people put to death by our state since 1982. Our campaign to stop his execution is one of the most intense and proudest of my 20 plus years as an anti-death penalty advocate. And his execution just still haunts me and is, to me, so devastating because of what it represented. You know, we now have 2 teenage girls who are now fatherless, troubled adolescents who are deprived of his critical message and his critical mentorship. We have the pleas of a victim's family ignored, and a meaningless clemency process. To me, these are the consequences of the death penalty. Sorry, y'all. I was going to have a few slides for you. I'm having trouble finding them. Let's see. Mike, are you able to pull up my slides? I'm sorry.
No, I will do that.
Having trouble finding power.
Give me 1 second for it to load up.
Sorry about that. So one of the many tragedies of Chris Young's case to me is that of timing. So Chris was sentenced to death in 2006 in San Antonio, which is part of Bexar County. But from 2009 to the present, Bexar County juries have only sentenced 2 people to death. They've rejected it in 4 other cases in that time frame. And I firmly believe that if Chris had committed that same crime today, prosecutors would not have sought the death penalty or secured it in trial. And this is because of the significant shifts that have occurred in the death penalty landscape over the last 2 decades. So as you can see on this slide, death sentences in Texas have plummeted from a peak of 48 death verdicts in 1999 to single digits for the past 6 years, and a record low 2 death sentences last year as the COVID-19 pandemic brought jury trials to a halt. Certainly is part of a larger trend though, however, and I firmly believe we would have continued to have fewer death sentences even without the impact of the pandemic. So Chris was executed in July 2018, as I said. A new district attorney for Bexar County was elected in November of that year, and he has taken a very limited approach to the death penalty. He's taken it off the table in all but 1 capital case, and no one has been executed from Bexar County during his tenure. So no one has been executed from that county since Chris Young was put to death. And this also reflects just a slow decline in the number of executions in Texas each year. Last year, 2020, 3 people were put to death in our state, which was the fewest executions since 1996. A large part of that is due to the pandemic. I would note, though, that Texas still is one of only 2 states, plus the federal government, to carry out any executions during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you'll see on the next slide, last year, there were a total of 17 executions in the United States. The federal government accounted for 10 of those. And then most of the other ones happened in January and February, so right before the declaration of disasters statewide. This same decline in the death penalty use has occurred in Dallas County, where District Attorney John Creuzot was elected in November 2018 and has also taken a very limited approach to the death penalty. The death penalty has never been uniformly imposed in the state of Texas, and now more than ever, it's isolated geographically. So out of our 254 counties, half of them, more than half, have never sent anyone to death row. And historically, we've seen it really concentrated in just a few jurisdictions statewide. And to me, this reinforces the arbitrariness of capital punishment, such that where the crime occurs matters more than the circumstances of the crime itself in terms of the punishment.
I know there is.
That is meted out. So if you could go back just to the previous slide. So this slide shows that even in the most historical high use places like Harris County and Tarrant County, the use has declined. Harris County, back in the 1990s, it was typical for juries to sentence 13, 15 people to death in a given year. There have been a total of 3 death sentences out of that county over the past 5 years. Tarrant County and Walker are the only other counties that have where juries have imposed more than 1 death sentence in that time frame. It's notable that Dallas does not appear on this list, even though it ranks second to Harris County historically in use of the death penalty. But there's only been 1 new death sentence imposed by a Dallas County juror since 2013. So on the next slide, you'll see just some stats for use of the death penalty in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. So Dallas has imposed 108 death sentences since 1974, ranking second just behind Harris County. Tarrant County has had 75 put on death row, and both counties are kind of in the top 4 in terms of executions carried out as well. Right now we have 204 people on death row. This is down from upwards of 500 people who were awaiting execution in the 1990s. So you could see it's declined quite considerably. Of these 204 people, Dallas County, Tarrant, and Harris account for more than half of the people there. So again, where the crime occurs and where the person is convicted really plays a huge role in the imposition of the death penalty and executions in Texas. So even as use of the death penalty has declined in Texas, some things have not changed. One of them is the continued disproportionate impact of the death penalty on people of color and racial bias in its administration. So both historically and in recent years, we see that the death penalty continues to be imposed disproportionately on individuals of color. 70% of the death sentences imposed over the last 5 years have involved people of color. And this is particularly true in those counties that use the death penalty most often. Of the 14 men sentenced to death in Dallas or Tarrant County since 2010, 11 are Black. So even as use declines, we still see many systemic problems with the death penalty in Texas. So, and I would just direct you to a really important report that the Death Penalty Information Center published last fall, Enduring Injustice, the Persistence of Racial Discrimination in the U.S. Death Penalty, which really shows the way that race infects the death penalty system from top to bottom, and the way that it reflects this, historical roots of systemic racism in our country. So Chris Young was guilty of the crime that sent him to death row, and he did not deny that, and he accepted responsibility for his actions. But guilt isn't always the case of individuals who are sentenced to death. And the risk of error has been a key factor in states that have done away with the death penalty. Most recently, the Commonwealth of Virginia voted to abolish the death penalty, and that bill is just awaiting the signature of the governor, which would make Virginia the 23rd state to abandon the death penalty through judicial or legislative action. Nationwide, 185 people have been exonerated after serving time on death row. This includes 16 people in Texas, including high-profile cases like Randall Dale Adams, who had been wrongfully convicted in Dallas County, was exonerated many years ago. We also know just in Dallas, there are many people who've been exonerated of serious crimes that did not, who were not sent to death row, but served, decades in prison for crimes they did not commit. More than 50 individuals have been exonerated from Dallas County or out of Dallas County since 2001. Many of those on the basis of DNA evidence and or mistaken eyewitness identification. So what we are doing in the death penalty in Texas is to both reduce the use of the death penalty by preventing new death sentences and stopping execution, and also advocating for change at the county and state level. On the state level, the Texas legislature is currently in session, and there have been bills filed in both the House and Senate that would do away with the death penalty. So we are advocating that those bills receive hearings in their respective committees. There also are a number of other death penalty related bills that have been filed that would address circumstances of convictions in the kind of who should be eligible for the death penalty. For example, exempting people with severe mental illness from receiving the death penalty, and some other kind of due process legislation. On the county level, TCADP works to persuade elected district attorneys to pursue the death penalty. So that can mean either, advocating that they not pursue the death penalty in a capital case, or that they work to resolve post-conviction challenges involving people who have already been sentenced to death, and resolving those cases with something other than the death penalty. And then we also work to amplify the stories of people who are impacted by violence and the death penalty. It is a real privilege to partner with faith leaders and religious organizations throughout the state in this work. And there's been no better partner than my friend and yours, Marv Knox. And so I'm so pleased that he is here with us tonight to share his personal journey on this issue with us. I want to thank you again for inviting me to be with you, and look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thanks.
Sorry, it helps if I unmute myself. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to Royal Lane and Mike for this opportunity in the committee. It's really a delight to spend an evening with a church that I have revered forever, and a pastor friend that I love as a brother, and also a special opportunity to be on this program with Kristin, who is truly one of my heroes. She's at the top echelon of Texans who are laboring to make our state more just, and doing a great job at it, and take seriously the gospel and Jesus' command, or in his inaugural sermon that he came to give release to the captives. And so I'm grateful. Also, I should say hello from Stephen Reeves. Mike mentioned that he was kind and didn't say it quite this way, but that I'm a lame duck. and my successor has been chosen. We're a small organization. Fellowship Southwest was started in 2017. I think I've told you all about it on a Wednesday night before at church. And we have just one staff member. And so we got a grant to be able to choose my successor. I'll be retiring at the end of the year. And Stephen, many of you all may recall, was counsel for the Christian Life Commission in Austin. He worked closely with Kristin on some issues when he was in Texas, and he's been with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And he's moving back to Texas to lead Fellowship Southwest. And I told him where I was going to be tonight. And he said to tell y'all high, and how much he appreciates Royal Lane, and particularly that he believes in this cause that we're talking about this evening. And I would just like to share a conversion story with you this evening. I think my background sort of defines conservative Texas. I grew up a Southern Baptist preacher's kid. I grew up in the Texas Panhandle. I lived in small towns, and my daddy was pastor of small churches. And so my foundation growing up was such that I don't know that I ever advocated for the death penalty, but I took it for granted from the start. I accepted the word justice in the criminal justice system. I thought people got what they deserved. That God had capital punishment and Texas in mind when God coined the phrase "an eye for an eye." And I have to say, probably the first step toward my conversion took place in a sociology class at Hardin-Simmons University my sophomore year, when I first considered the idea that my perspective, my norms as a kid from a small town in rural Texas was not normative for the whole world. I mean, I can remember what the air felt like when I realized that, and it was a startling concept for me. But I began from that point with some good teachers and mentors to empathize and to pay attention to the world around me and people whose backgrounds and lives were quite different. And then as a Christian who hoped to grow, as a Baptist journalist who covered all kinds of issues, including the death penalty, capital punishment, and try to consider things that were important to our communities and to our churches, my perspective began to change. And so now I would say I oppose the death penalty for several reasons. And Kristin has beautifully given the background and details for many of those. But the first one is that the demonstration of false convictions and the increase in exonerations undermine the very notion that capital punishment is just. I think if I wrote the numbers down right, she said that there have been 183 death penalty exonerations in the country and 16 in Texas. And if you guys, anybody reads the newspaper, pays attention in Dallas County across the last decade or so, we've seen scores and scores of exonerations. And so if people can be wrongfully convicted, then putting them to death is just a compounding of evil and injustice. Another one is the disparity of the demographics. And the first is that Black people are far more likely, Black males in particular, are far more likely to be put to death than whites. And then a thing that Kristin has taught me is the importance of geography. And I had not paid that close attention to it, but when she shows the inequity of living in the wrong county and the opportunity or the likelihood, particularly if you're a Black male, that you're going to be sentenced to death, is just staggering. And that undermines the notion that capital punishment is equitable. Also, the finality of capital punishment undermines a faithful notion that I've been taught since I was a little boy, and that is that lives can be changed and that Jesus can make a difference in the lives of people. If we put people to death, then we either blunt the work that Jesus has already done, that God has already done in redeeming souls, or we sometimes prevent them from ever having an opportunity for change and transformation. And that seems to me to be antithetical to the gospel. And then finally, I would just say that Jesus, who was a victim of capital punishment himself, taught repentance and redemption and transformation. And I can't, for the life of me, fathom the notion that Jesus would invoke the death penalty as a tool of criminal justice. So I've been converted. You heard my altar call story tonight, but I thank God for seeing things a different way. I've been grateful when Stephen was at the Christian Life Commission, I believe, and many of you all knew Phil Strickland, and they came away with a moratorium on the death penalty and caught hell for it. but began taking a step in the right direction. And I pray many of us, millions of us, will be continuing to take steps in the right direction, that Texas will do away with the death penalty. So thanks so much for letting me be with you tonight. Thanks, Mike and Royal Lane, for inviting me, and Kristin for letting me be on the program with somebody that I admire so much.
So this is a time for questions. I posted something that's a question that I have. So Kristin, you may want to talk about this. One is, what are steps that we can take as individuals and as a congregation to help the Texas legislature, like Virginia did recently, abolish the death penalty? So that's one question. And then can you talk a little bit more about the cost of, like, the economics around the death penalty compared to life in prison?
Sure. I think I'll do the second question first in terms of the cost of the death penalty. So as I said, the death sentences have declined precipitously in Texas, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that Texas was the last death penalty state to adopt life in prison without the possibility of parole as a sentencing option in capital cases. It did so in 2005, and that has given prosecutors and juries more discretion in terms of how they handle these cases. But another big factor has been the exorbitant cost of the death penalty. It is counterintuitive in many ways, but the death penalty is vastly more expensive than alternative punishments. And the meter starts running from the moment that the district attorney decides to seek the death penalty in a capital case. A trial in which the prosecution is seeking the death penalty takes a very long time. It takes a trial, and then the trial itself is quite lengthy. A jury selection process in a case involving a death penalty, it typically lasts 2 months, if not longer, because each potential juror is questioned individually on his or her ability to consider the full range of punishments, including the death penalty. And then when you get to the trial process, there's two distinct phases in the capital case. There's a guilt innocence phase, and then if the defendant is convicted, then they move to a punishment phase, and that's where the prosecution argues for the death penalty and the defense argues for mercy and presents mitigating factors that seek to present a full picture of their client and reasons that mitigate against a death sentence. So all of it is a very expensive process. It involves expert testimony, and we've seen examples in Texas, especially in our smaller rural counties, where those trials cost upwards of $1 million, led Jasper County, for example, to increase taxes. We've seen other places where they had to deny employee raises for the county because of the very expensive death penalty trial. And again, that's just for the trial itself. And then, you have the years, if not decades, of appeals, which are handled at the state and federal level. So the original cost is borne by the county, and then the state kind of takes over from there. But, if anything happens that sends the case back to the county for another trial or a new sentencing hearing, for example, then you're looking at hundreds and more thousands of dollars. So just that cost of the death penalty has led a lot of prosecutors to opt not to seek it, and has also helped to persuade legislators and decision makers around the country to move away from the death penalty or end it altogether. So I'd say, cost and innocence are among the two kind of top reasons that legislators have cited in other states in their decisions to get rid of the death penalty. In terms of what you can do to advocate with your state legislators, they really just need to hear from you on this issue. And if you support doing away with the death penalty, letting them know that you support the bills that have been filed. Legislators do not hear from their constituents on this issue as much as they need to in Texas. So we highly encourage that, especially if the bill, gets a hearing in the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, letting your legislators know, but, not just during the session, like, throughout your, just throughout the year, they need to be hearing from their constituents on this issue. And I also think not just the legislatures, certainly have the ability to change the law, but in Texas, the real change that we have seen has been at the local level. So, district attorney is the chief law enforcement officer in your county, and that person is elected. So what we've seen in Texas and around the country in recent years is the election of what are called reform-oriented prosecutors. So I would put Dallas County DA John Cruzo in that camp, and we have a handful of others around the state. But those elections are really important, and just participating in them, educating yourself on the candidates and also on judicial candidates. All of our judges in Texas are elected, including the members of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. And so as voters, you have a lot of opportunity to make a difference on this issue.
Thanks. Marv, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Another
He's
question.
the expert. I'm sorry, I was muted.
Yeah. We have another question that came in. What resources should we share with others to help them consider their view of the death penalty, like books or documentaries?
Yeah, there's so many great ones. I mean, I'm sure many of you have read Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. I think that's such a terrific resource about his work as an attorney representing Walter McMillan, an innocent man on death row in Alabama. I can also recommend a memoir by Anthony Graves, who spent 18 years in prison, including 12 and a half years on death row here in Texas. He's written really a wonderful account of that experience or that nightmare. But also just his resilience and his ability to survive that. And, he really is one of the most incredible human beings I know. So I think that's a terrific resource. In terms of documentaries or films, I really liked The Innocence Files, which was a series put out by Netflix last year, including, so it's I think 8 or 9 different episodes, and they focus on a wide range of cases involving wrongful convictions and some of the key factors in those cases. But there's one episode that focuses on our most recent death row exoneree in Texas, Alfred Dwayne Brown, and the just egregious prosecutorial misconduct that led to his wrongful incarceration on death row for about a decade. And then if you're looking for kind of more feature films, I still think Dead Man Walking holds a lot of value. There's another movie called Trial by Fire that focuses on the case of Cameron Todd Willingham, who many people believe is an innocent man who was executed by the state of Texas in 2004. Those would be my top. And then there's a new book. Finally, the last one I recommend, there's a new book by Maurice Shama, who's a journalist with the Marshall Project, called Let the Lord Sort Them, The Rise and Fall of the Death Penalty. And it focuses mostly on Texas, the history of the death penalty in Texas, or in the modern, what we call the modern era, since the 1970s, and looks at the issue through the lens of a couple key people, including defense attorneys, a former Texas Court of Criminal Appeals judge, and others. And I think it's written in a very accessible way.
Thank you. There are no more questions in chat. Anybody have a question they want to voice? If you can unmute yourself, you can ask that now too. We'll give another holy pause here.
What are there any current? Oh, sorry, Barbara. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to know the names of those House bills that Kristin mentioned earlier. I went to get a pen and then I missed them, so I could address them to my representatives.
Sure. The House bill is House Bill 215, which has been filed by Representative Joe Moody.
Okay.
And the Senate bill is Senate Bill 188, and that's been filed by Senator Eddie Lucio, who's from Brownsville.
Thank you.
Are there any current cases of anyone on death row that we should like be focused on or get behind? Or, you know, I know there's Julius Jones in Oklahoma. Are there any in Texas that are coming close to their execution date? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So at this time there are 4 people scheduled who have execution dates in Texas. 2 of them actually are from Tarrant County. I think, there's problematic issues in all of them. So at this point, the attorneys aren't seeking public advocacy, but that'll certainly change as we get closer to those dates. I think a case you may have heard of that was in the public eye 2 years ago was Rodney Reed, who has steadfastly maintained his innocence of the crime for which he was convicted. He received a last-minute stay of execution from the Court of Criminal Appeals. This was in October, November of 2019, and things were delayed in his case, like so many others, because of the pandemic. But he's scheduled to have an evidentiary hearing on his claim of actual innocence and some other issues in May, I believe, in Bastrop. So definitely would keep an eye on that case. And then, we have a couple other cases of individuals who were convicted, and where junk science played a role in their conviction, and they've challenged their cases in the courts and have been denied. Actually, one of those cases is from Dallas, a man by the name of Charles Flores, who the only eyewitness in the case, a neighbor who was looking out her window and saw a car pull up to her neighbor's house, was hypnotized by the police, and was only able to identify Mr. Flores 13 months later while he was sitting at the defense table at his trial. But she played a very key role in his conviction. And so we have some legislators who have filed bills that are challenging this use of like forensic hypnosis in criminal cases. But Mr. Flores currently the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied relief to him. He had appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they declined to consider his case in this issue of forensic hypnosis. So, it's kind of back in the state court. So I would definitely keep an eye on all of those cases. And we work very closely with attorneys in all of these cases, and all of our actions are driven by what's going to be helpful to them in their legal strategy. So as we have more information, we put that available on our website, and we'll issue action alerts in certain cases, asking people to contact the Board of Pardons and Paroles or some other kinds of actions. So if you're interested in subscribing to our contact list, we can keep in touch with you that way, or through Mike, who receives our emails. We'll keep you abreast of cases that we're working on and opportunities for your involvement.
Yeah, and Marv said that the TCADP newsletter is a good way to get information, and I echo that. You always send good links of like how we can sign on to letters, how we can take action. So can you share with us how people can get kind of signed up for your communication?
Sure.
Just go to the website.
Yeah, if you just go to, so I was going to see if I could put it in the chat, but well. So our website is just tcadp.org, and then right on the homepage in the top right, you'll see a subscribe to our contact list link. And we do our best not to inundate you with emails, only things that are going to be most relevant and timely. And that's a great way for us to keep in touch with you about the bills in the legislature as well, and whether that if there's movement on them, and action opportunities around those as well.
I have a question, kind of, I don't know, I think you can answer it. When you were first saying that the numbers were decreasing, like in Dallas County and other places, I was thinking, oh, that's because lawyers are now more likely to be against the death penalty. But then you were saying, in part, it's so expensive. It's not necessarily that people are against the death penalty, it's that it's too expensive. So when you look at a state like Texas, where do you say the kind of the majority of support for the death penalty itself is coming from? Is it coming from kind of everyday citizens? Is it coming from prosecutors? Is it coming from judges? Is it coming from politicians who want to look tough on crime? Like, when you kind of think this is the place where we have the most support for the death penalty, that would make it hard for Texas to follow in the steps of some of other states that are really starting to outlaw it and stand more firmly against it. In Texas, where is the support for the death penalty coming from? Or is that just too diverse to kind of capture in 5 minutes?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's coming, I think it does come from all of those places that you mentioned. I mean, definitely from some prosecutors, but not all. And, we're seeing some changes there, from a lot of judges, but certainly, I would say there's still pretty strong support among most, or among many legislators. But I think there are a couple things there are two big challenges. One is just the lack of education and awareness of the realities of the death penalty. So I think that there's been just sort of this knee-jerk reaction, and maybe it's kind of like what Marv was saying, of like, well, yeah, Texas has the death penalty and we're always going to have the death penalty. And people don't necessarily give it much thought because it doesn't impact their lives and directly, which is a good thing, but sometimes make it hard to get people to really like care and take this on as a cause. And then kind of coupled with that, I think it's just this, just sort of this idea of the status quo. I mean, even though there's so many people, in the legislature who have no idea that the death penalty that the landscape has shifted the way that it has. I mean, I think especially among the members of the legislature who have been there for a long time, I think their mindset is still stuck in 2000, really, and they haven't necessarily caught up to all the ways that the death penalty landscape has changed, and all of the voices that are calling for it to end. And because we have, just as we have a lot of prosecutors who support the death penalty, we have a lot of former district attorneys and former judges and people who have had that direct experience and involvement with the criminal legal system and seen the death penalty up close and personal, and just cannot abide by it anymore. And so I think our biggest challenge in Texas is that, I like and you might have heard this expression, I think Sister Helen is most often credited with saying that support for the death penalty is a mile wide and an inch deep, right? It's just something that people don't necessarily have given enough thought to. So it's our job to continue to educate the public and decision makers and community leaders about all of the flaws and failures of the death penalty, and also to bring awareness of the changes in Texas. Something we hear around the country, people like to say, like, well, look, even in Texas, death sentences are declining, or even in Texas, executions are being stopped, or what have you. And so we know that our measures of progress in Texas are different than in other states, but they're no less significant, and that what we do here has a ripple effect throughout the country, just like what happens when another state abolishes the death penalty has an impact here.
Any other folks have a last question? Okay. Kristin, Marv, any last comments for us?
Thanks. Keep up the faith and the good work, and I think we're on a long journey, but I believe we'll get there. And as someone who grew up in Texas, I never thought I could say that at some point in my life. It's a testimony to Kristin and a lot of people of faith who really care.
Thanks, Marv. And yes, just want to thank you all so much again for the opportunity to speak with you and share information. And I really appreciate your interest in this issue and look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, I'll put Kristin and Marv's bios up in on the YouTube link. I didn't hit record until after Kristin started talking, so I missed a little bit at the beginning with the bios. I'll put that up, and then so thank you, Kristin, for your passion, your expertise to help move Texas in a just and loving direction. Marv, thank you for your leadership too. Well, I'm so glad y'all were here with us. Everybody, thank you for being here as well. If you have further thoughts or questions, let me know, and we'll try to get some answers for you. And also make sure you go to tcadp.org and get information about all the stuff that is going on in Texas regarding the death penalty. So thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Yes, thank you.